We have already looked at two zones of employment and zones of marriage. Now let's look at the third zone, that is the zone of religious conversion. As we know, the British government, the East India Company in the first place, together with the crown of and the parliament, uh, believed that religious conversion stoked problems in India, and they prohibited missionary activity in India, uh, and it was not actively sponsored by the British government or East India Company in their territory itself till 1813. So till that long, the British government, the East India Company through the Crown and Parliament, did not allow conversion because as it stoked domestic disturbance till 1813. Only in 1813 this stricture is removed. Example of this will be the Sirampur mission, which was operating from the Dutch territories, which also tells us that the zone of religious conversion was not only monopolized by the British or English in that sense. There were the Portuguese, the Danes, and the French who were there. So, if Indians were converting to any of them, it also meant an access to any of these European languages. In Portuguese Goa, conversion implied fluency in Portuguese. In British India, it obviously meant anglicized Indians. Interestingly, many writers also come up thanks to this kind of a conversion policies and acts of conversion that happens. Immediately, the person that comes to my mind will be Michael Madhusudan Dutt again. Dutt converts to Christianity during the course of his life, being dissatisfied with the state of Hinduism in India and Bengal per se, and goes on to marry European women who, as we read, impact his life and writing greatly. Derozio is a good example of this zone of religious conversion. So is Govind Chandra Dutt and his brother Girish Chandra Dutt, whose daughters Aru and Toru Dutt are the first Indian women English poets. So we have a range of writers who come from this kind of a conversion zone itself, again furthering the story of English in India. A very significant example, contemporary example of this is poet Jayanta Mahapatra, who comes from Odisha. He talks about this in his poem called Grandfather. His grandfather lived during one of the devastating famines of Odisha, 1866, where almost a third of Odisha's population was wiped out. During this period, many people died due to hunger, and people who were not uh, dead, many of them converted because the Christian missionaries were offering food, and once they accepted that food, uh, they were they were deserted and banished from their Hindu societies. Mahapatra's grandfather was one such person who, out of desperation, went into the food camps organized by the missionaries and ate there, only to be banished by the Hindus afterwards. These people who ate at those camps were known as the Chhatrakhiyas. Chhatra meaning camps, food camps, that they ate at those camps. So that word actually becomes a word of abuse in Odia post 1866, and these converts were also known as those Chhatrakhiyas, and that's why Mahapatra has a very unique and a troubled relationship with Hindu religion, which he demonstrates in many of his poems. Especially grandfather talks about those generations of trauma where this eminent poet in English lives in Cuttack, Odisha, amidst many of the Hindus who do not know this kind of a history that is there with him. The poem Grandfather is written in English, which tells us again of this life of English that continues beyond its official legislative versions. The social life, as I was talking to you about in the beginning itself, can be very well understood in that sense through Mahapatra's life itself. Mahapatra as the person, as someone who belongs to that abusive category called Chhatrakiya, which is again a resultant of life of English in India from the zone of religious conversion. We will now move to the last bit of this religious conversion part, which is the institutions by Christian missionaries, which have resulted in notable higher educational institutions like Loreto Convent in Calcutta, Xavier's College in Bombay, or St. Stephen's in Delhi, which have produced numerous writers, like from Bharti Mukherjee, Adil Jusawala, Eunice D'Souza, to Shashi Tharoor, Upamanyu Chatterjee, Mukul Keshavan. All of them have come from these colleges or higher educational institutions which are run by Christian missionaries. Many of our schools around us today, colleges around us today are run by those Christian missionaries, which started with this, from this zone of religious conversion, which started with figures like Henry de Rosio, with figures like Michael Datta, with figures like Toru Dutt, and has a continuing presence with, I think, not even just these famous authors like writers from the St. Stephen's, but also in our everyday life where children who pursue education at these institutions themselves. One final zone that Dharwadkar identifies is the zone of friendship. The zone of friendship that existed between the British and the Indians, the zone of friendship and social relations, right? So, I will go back to the example of Passage to India, where we look at again the relationship between Dr. Aziz and Ronnie Heaslop, Narayan Godbole and Adela Quested. This was a very interesting book for that reason, and also exemplifies this zone of friendship and social relationship in India. I don't want to talk about the book here, but it will be important for us to understand that the book highlights many of these kinds of relationships. As I was highlighting, the purported event that happens at the Marabar caves, where Adela Quested comes out accusing Dr. Aziz of sexually assaulting her, presents a crisis moment in the British uh, presence in India. Why? Because obviously a native man has assaulted a white woman, supposedly higher in terms of power, in terms of race, but also it tells us that she had also formed a kind of a friendship with Dr. Aziz. That's why she agreed to go with him to the Marabar caves itself. If you read the first half of it, there is a very interesting relationship that exists between Dr. Aziz and Ronnie Hislop and Adela Quested herself. That's something that Dharwadkar is also talking about in terms of zones of friendship and social relationship. He talks about many Indians. Again, we are talking about Dubashis here. If some of the closest social bonds in the pre-colonial period were between the young company officials and their personal Dubashis, as we were talking about when we looked at the zones of employment, I was talking about how it subverts that hierarchical relationship between the master and the subject, and Dharwadkar repeats that idea. In the early colonial period, they were between early Orientalist administrators, scholars, and missionary scholars, and their Indian assistant and collaborators. Starting late 18th century, British-Indian friendships based on mutual respect, depths of personal feeling and commitment, and shared attitudes and common intellectual and artistic interest were founded in various contexts. Examples are many. Din Muhammad, Godfrey Ivan Baker, William A. Bailey, Ram Mohan Roy, William Adam, Land Carpenter, William A. Ellery Channing, and Joseph Tuckerman. These were people who shared very deep relationships with Ram Mohan Roy. Henry DeRossio, David Drummond, and John Grant. Pandita Ramabai, Dorothy Vail, Manmohan Ghosh, and Lawrence Binion. This was the whole kind of spectrum of relationship where you see women interacting with other women, white women, Indian women working with white women, Indian men working with British men. Also, there were interracial networks of contact that existed, like between Rabindranath Tagore, Mohandas Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, E.M. Foster, and C.F. Andrews, as we would see. So, the relationship between East and West, the kind of friendships that we start seeing, the kind of relationships that abound, that mark the British-India relationships. Again, English plays a vital role here in forging these relationships, in solidifying these relationships, and many of these relationships I will go back to again the colonial nostalgia angle that I was talking about. If you read those accounts of what I was telling you from this book called Charles Allen's Plain Tales from the Raj, you would see that these accounts go beyond ideas of colonization. Ideas, obviously, they were brought together because of colonization, but they talk about each other across and beyond racial and national boundaries. They talk in terms of relationships of friendship, passion, humanity in general, which is very important to also keep in mind that many subject positions come out of this interaction which are very novel in their own ways. These are relationships that were unexpected, that one did not think that there will be such relationships between, let's say, Gandhi and C.F. Andrews. And there are pages and pages written about them, that how these relationships are born and how these relationships are sustained. For example, relationships between many colonial administrators and their Orientalist assistants. I can think of Odia writer called Fakir Mohan Senapati, who forges very solid interactions about the Odia grammar with this colonial administrator called John Beams, and that leads to personal relationships where Fakir Mohan eulogizes John Beams, his his contribution to Odias and Odia literature when Odia was supposed to be abolished as a language. John Beams comes to its rescue, tries to mobilize the native intellectuals like Fakir Mohan, Radhanath Roy, et al. You see a relationship that goes beyond these kinds of administrative conveniences and racial relationships, segregations, they become not that important. So, what we get to see then, that between the period of 1660 to 1760, each of these four primary contact zones drew certain types of Indians into its ambit, introduced them to English language, enabled them to anglicize themselves in oral and written communication, exposed them to Western cultures at close and intimate range, and provided them with the space necessary for a transforming acculturation. So, prior to Indians even writing literature in English, Indians were acculturating themselves in English, through English. What the examples of those we get to see through these four contact zones. One very important thing to remember at this point of time is that all the people who are interacting with the British at this point of time are at least bilingual, if not multilingual. And many of them go on to shape the languages that they are proficient in 19th century. 19th century will see a host of writers who will be proficient in at least 2 or 3 languages, one of them being English, of course, and the example of that will be Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, whom we will read in our as his text, The Rajmohan's Wife, a little bit later into the course. But an example of this one already sees in the face of Ram Mohan Roy. Even before Ram Mohan Roy, we have someone called C.V. Boraiya, who is proficient in Telugu and English, writes an account called the Accounts of Jains for Indians and the British administrators. Ram Mohan Roy, as we know, is quite proficient in multiple languages. We have already seen a demonstration of this in his letter to Lord Amherst for the need of modern education. Roy wrote his first work in Defense of Monotheism is in Persian with a introduction in Arabic. Then he goes on to write multiple works in Bengali, translating the Upanishads into Bengali also. And then he also writes in English, for which he becomes very close to the Unitarians across the Atlantic in America and England, for which he is greatly revered and respected in that sphere also. So one starts seeing through these zones of contact many new subjectivities coming up, many new modern Indian figures coming up. And one of those figures is Deen Mohammed. And we will now move towards reading Deen Mohammed's account, which is instrumental for this course because it's the first account by an Indian in English. Secondly, it is also important because it signals a crucial node in the life of English in India. 1794, Deen Mohammed publishes Travels, and post that we see figures like C.V. Boraiya and Ram Mohan Roy writing in English. That's why I would situate, like Dharwadkar, following him, Deen Mohammed as a crucial node in this social life of English in India. Thank you.